Now I have the honor to present Mr. Irwin Cotler. Irwin Cotler is the chairman of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, an emeritus professor of law at McGill University, former member of parliament, former minister of justice and attorney general of Canada, and an international human rights lawyer. A constitutional and comparative law scholar, Professor Cotler intervened in landmark Charter of Rights cases in the areas of free speech, freedom of religion, minority rights, peace law, and war crimes justice. As Minister of Justice and Attorney General, Irwin Cotler initiated the first ever comprehensive reform of the Supreme Court appointment process and helped it make it the most gender representative Supreme Court in the world. Appointed the first ever Aboriginal and visible minority justice to the Ontario Court of the Appeal, and so on, and so on. A leading parliamentarian on the global stage, she has been chair of the Inter-Parliamentary Group for Human Rights in Iran, for example. An international human rights lawyer, Professor Cotler, has served as counsel to prisoners of conscience, including Andrei Sakharov and Nathan Sharansky or Nelson Mandela. He is a recipient of 12 honorary doctorates, so I only mentioned Irwin Cotler and not doctor, where he has been recognized as a scholar and advocate of international stature. He has been named an officer of the Order of Canada, and so on, and so on. Please, Mr. Cotler, we are honored to hear your speech.
Thank you for that very kind and warm words of introduction. I'm very pleased to be here and to participate in what I would take to be the larger common cause which brings us together. The struggle against racism, against hate, against anti-Semitism, against mass atrocity, and against the crime whose name we should even shudder to mention, namely genocide. And mostly, and here I reference my mentor and teacher, Elie Wiesel, against indifference and inaction in the face of injustice and anti-Semitism. And all this is part of the larger struggle for justice, for peace and human rights in our time. As it happens, we meet at an important moment of remembrance and reminder, of bearing witness and taking action. We meet in the aftermath of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, reminding us of horrors too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened. Of the Holocaust, as Elie Wiesel would remind us again and again, of a war against the Jews in which not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were targeted victims. On the 70th anniversary year, which we've just launched, moving towards both the Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Genocide Convention as the Never Again Convention that has been called, but where genocide has occurred again and again. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as the Magna Carta of the UN, which former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan said, and I quote, emerged from the ashes of the Holocaust, intended to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And where has he put it? Statement forgotten, but I think which bears a reminder today, and particularly in this conference, that a UN that fails to be at the forefront of the struggle against anti-Semitism and other forms of racism denies its history and undermines its future. We meet also in the aftermath of the 73rd anniversary of the liberation of the death camp Oswiecim, which, as Holocaust survivor Noah Kliger summarized so succinctly, the largest cemetery in the world, as he put it, in which there are no graves. From 1942 to the beginning of 1945, and you see this if you go through one of the barracks in Auschwitz, as I have a number of times. You see a panel which says 1.3 million people were deported to Auschwitz. 1.1 million of them were Jews. What it doesn't add, but which bears express reference and reminder today, is that Jews were murdered in Auschwitz because of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism itself did not die in Auschwitz. And it remains the bloodied and often mutated canary in the mineshaft of global evil today. And so, in this context of remembrance and reminder, I want to share with you some thoughts, some concerns, some reflections, and if time permits, at the end of some proposals as to what we might do. In terms of assaults on the Jewish condition and the human condition, of assaults on Jews and assaults on human rights, of the state of Jews in the world today and the state of human rights inhabited by Jews, and the state of the world inhabited by Jews. And one cannot really separate, if I can use the term here, the intersectionality in that regard in order to understand both. The whole scene also through the looking glass of escalating global anti-Semitism on the one hand, and escalating global terrorism, and in particular terrorism targeting Jews on the other. And where the anti-Semitism underpins the terrorism, and in fact may even lead to the terrorism, and as we've learned only too often and too well, that while it may begin with Jews, doesn't end with Jews. So with regard to hatred as a whole, so with regard to terrorism. Of anti-Semitism as not only the oldest and most enduring of hatreds, but also the most lethal. Of anti-Semitism as a paradigm of radical hatred, as a Holocaust is a paradigm of radical evil. A lethal obsession, as our friend and colleague, the late Robert Wistrich, put it, and I'd like to just reference his magisterial work on anti-Semitism as a lethal obsession, which should be required for all students and teachers and practitioners of anti-Semitism. And so the underlying thesis of my remarks today is that we are witnessing, and indeed have been witnessing for some time, an old, new, global, escalating, sophisticated, virulent, and even lethal anti-Semitism that is grounded in classical anti-Semitism, but distinguishable from it, that found its first institutional, juridical, international expression in the Zionism as Racism resolution of 1975, but has gone dramatically beyond that, as I'll seek to show, and which the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations at the time, Daniel Moynihan, in a pithy statement understanding the fallout here, said that the resolution gave the abomination of anti-Semitism, as he put it, the appearance of international legal sanction. A new anti-Semitism, which we need also a new vocabulary to define it, but which can best be defined or find expression in a set of metrics anchored in human rights and international law, conceptualization in general, and equality rights and equality law in particular, and also underpinning as it does the IRA definition. And I want to pay tribute to Mark Weitzman for his sustained work over the years, which brought us to an IRA definition which combines both the old and the new. In other words, traditional anti-Semitism is a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the rights of Jews to live as equal members in whatever state or society they inhabit. The new anti-Semitism is a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the right of the Jewish people and the state of Israel to live as an equal member of the family of nations. Now, we have developed metrics to identify the old and classical anti-Semitism. Interestingly enough, the Anti-Defamation League, in a global survey in 2014, anchoring itself in 11 of these classical metrics and posing the questions, do the Jews have too much power, do the Jews control the economy, etc., determined at the end of that global survey that anti-Semitism was a persistent and pervasive virus. But I suggest to you that if we don't factor in the new metrics, we may come to a rather disturbing outcome and not fully appreciate what is happening. For example, using the metrics in that survey, global survey, and I'll take one country, Sweden, it had a percentage of only 4% were anti-Semitic according to the traditional metrics. But if you ask a question, how many of you believe that Israel is acting in the same way as the Nazis did, and that Israel, in effect, being a Nazi state, a question that was put in another survey time, it goes up to about 40%. And so one has to look at issues of anti-Semitism, both in terms of the traditional metrics and in terms of a new set of metrics, which I'll discuss with you. Let me try to put this in context by referencing something that was said by Per Ahlmark, a former Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden, one of the great leaders in the struggle against anti-Semitism, who said in a rather pithy and prescient sense of appreciating the interaction of the old and anti-Semitism, and I'll just refer to as he put it, because he spoke how discrimination against Jews would move inexorably to discrimination against and assaults on the Jewish nation state in Israel. And then this would cause it to move back again to assaults on Jews themselves. And he concluded, and I quote, "In the past, the most dangerous anti-Semites were those who wanted to make the world Judenrein, free of Jews. Today, the most dangerous anti-Semites might be those who want to make the world Judenrein, free of a Jewish state." So may I summarize at this point some 5 metrics of the new anti-Semitism. I've described elsewhere some 12 metrics, but I don't want to unduly bore and burden you, so I'll seek to limit it to 5. These are, number 1, genocidal anti-Semitism, 2, demonological anti-Semitism, 3, political anti-Semitism, 4, anti-Jewish terror, and finally, the one that is the most sophisticated and perhaps maybe the most dangerous, because the others are at least overt and public and clear. But the one that I would call the laundering or the masking of anti-Semitism under universal public values, as it were, under our shared and common humanity, that is, in my view, the most pernicious and prejudicial and, in that sense, threatening. As I said, I also hope, if time permits, not to leave you with a brooding analytical analysis, but also with some specific proposals for what we can do. So let me begin with the first metric of the new anti-Semitism, what I would call genocidal anti-Semitism. This is not a term that I use lightly or easily. It is a term that I'm taking right out of the Genocide Convention's prohibition against the direct and public incitement to genocide. The toxic convergence of the advocacy of the most horrific of crimes, namely genocide, embedded in the most lethal of hatreds, namely anti-Semitism, and involving a public calling for the killing of Jews wherever they may be. As the Supreme Court of Canada put it, in upholding the constitutionality of our anti-hate legislation in Canada, which is closer to the European approach than it is to the American First Amendment approach. It embodies all the attributes of protected speech or the First Amendment, but when it comes to matters relating, for example, to the willful promotion of hatred or contempt against an identifiable people, people identifiable by reason of their race, religion, nationality, ethnicity, etc., and in particular with regard to the advocacy of genocide, then this is sanctioned and criminalized under our law. And that the Supreme Court of Canada, upholding the constitutionality of our hate law in that regard, used a statement that I thought summed it up very well, and I'm summing up a long, detailed legal announcement. I said that the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chamber, said the court. It began with words. These are the catastrophic effects of racism, added the court. These are the chilling facts of history. And in another case, a very important principle and precedent, which has gone almost unknown in the international legal community, but which deserves not only referencing, but acted upon. The Mugesera case, one that I was involved with as Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and in brief, abbreviated summary, Mugesera was a Rwandan who came to Canada in 1992 and sought refugee status, which he preliminarily received. In 1994, the genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda took place. In the legal proceedings, it moved from his refugee status being transformed to that of accusing and charging him of incitement to hatred and to genocide. And his defense was, well, how can you accuse me of that? I came to Canada in 1992. The genocide in Rwanda occurred in 1994. I wasn't even there. I had nothing to do with the genocide that took place. But what the court was able to determine on the evidence is that he had been involved in the incitement to hate and genocide, which led to the genocide that took place in 1994. And the court concluded, again in a very important judgment, where it said, the very incitement to hate and genocide constitutes the crime, whether or not acts of genocide follow. And that is why he was then deported back to Rwanda for trial, which took place there. So that's the first expression of genocidal anti-Semitism. But there are a number of others, and time does not permit me to elaborate, but just a few because of their particular importance. Second manifestation of genocidal anti-Semitism are the covenants and charters and declarations and programs of Iranian surrogates, Hamas, a Sunni surrogate, and Hezbollah, a Shiite surrogate. Perhaps I should just preface it by saying, because this too bears reference and is not sufficiently known, that the 21st century began with the Ayatollah Khamenei saying, and I quote, "There can be no solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict without the annihilation of the Jewish state." No euphemisms here about the Zionist entity, express and clear. And it moved from that over the last 17 years to other inciting references of the need to excise this cancerous tumor, Israel, from the Middle East, to manifestations of and parading of Shihab missiles with the emblem, "Wipe Israel off the map," to just last week, where yet again leaders of the IRGC called for the annihilation of the Jewish state. And what is so disturbing about these genocidal calls is that they are standing violations of that prohibition against the incitement to hate and genocide in the Genocide Convention, and which mandates state parties to the Genocide Convention. As I said, we are now moving in the 70th year anniversary of the genocide, mandates state parties to the Genocide Convention to in fact hold the leadership of those who engage in such incitement to account, as was done with regard to Mugesera. This is not a policy option. This is an international legal obligation of state parties to the Genocide Convention, who have yet to invoke it against any of the leaders in Iran in that regard. And I mention now Hamas and Hezbollah because they cannot be seen alone, but must be seen, as I said, as surrogates of their larger patron, Khamenei's Iran. And I use that term to distinguish it from the people and publics in Iran who are otherwise the targets of mass domestic repression, and we should not forget that dimension of it as well, of Khamenei's Iran. Now, I'm not saying anything new to this audience, and you've seen this morning in the slide. I'm not telling you anything new when I say that Hamas, in its own public charter, calls for the destruction of Israel and the killing of Jews wherever they may be. You can find it in Article 7. Now, in May 2017, they purported to amend it, but it's not clear whether the original charter is still in place, which I think it is, and that this has just been an amendment to it. But even if it isn't in place, the important thing to understand is if you look at the original Hamas Charter and Covenant, and as a parliamentarian, I tabled it in Parliament, and it shocked my colleagues in the Canadian Parliament, because while some of them may have known, and even here, very few, about the covenantal call in the Charter for the public killing of Jews wherever they may be, they did not know about the classical anti-Semitism in the Hamas Charter, where Jews, not Israelis, where Jews are accused of being responsible for all the ills of human history, responsible for the French Revolution, League of Nations, United Nations. I can go on. In other words, those things that we would look upon positively are looked upon as evils in the Hamas Charter, for which the Jews' evil footprint is responsible. The change in the charter that was amended in May 2017, the only change is that the word Jew is switched to Zionism. Everything else, in effect, remains the same. But of course, it becomes much more politically correct when you can accuse Zionism and Zionists than if you accuse Jews and Judaism. And with regard to Hezbollah, we know of its public threats for the destruction of Israel. Again, here I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, not only speaks about, quote unquote, Israel's disappearance, which you know about, but he is a classic case study of how the old and the new anti-Semitism come together. As he put it, if all the Jews were gathered in Israel, it would be easier to kill them all at the same time. And in a lesser known, but no less defamatory and incendiary expression, he said, if we search the entire world for a person more cowardly, despicable, weak, and feeble in psyche, mind, ideology, and religion, we would not find anyone like the Jew. And Nasrallah adds, note, I'm not saying the Israeli, I am saying the Jew. And so, Shiite scholar Amal Saad Garia, author of the book Hezbollah, Politics and Religion, summed this up succinctly and as well when she put it, and this juxtaposes what I've been saying up to now, that Nasrallah's statement provides moral justification and ideological justification for dehumanizing the Jews. And she went on to demonstrate the grave anti-Semitism underlying the terrorist assaults against Jews in Israel. Her quote, with which I conclude this analysis, the Israeli Jew becomes a legitimate target under this Nasrallah ideology for extermination. And it also legitimates attacks on Jews who are not Israelis. So again, the classical and new anti-Semitism come together. The whole serving as a form of prologue for the attacks against Jews themselves. Let me just mention very quickly one-liners, again for reasons of time. Some other manifestations of genocidal anti-Semitism. There are in fact 7. I've just given you 2. A third one are the religious fatwas or execution writs calling for the killing of Jews wherever they may be. I can give you a litany of them that find regular expressions by radical imams, whether they be in Paris or Berlin or in Spain or in North America, where Jews and Judaism, not just Israelis and Israel, Jews and Judaism are held out to be the perfidious enemy of Islam. And where in these incendiary genocidal calls, and I could quote chapter and verse if time permitted, Israel, as it were, emerges as the Salman Rushdie among the nations, the object of ongoing religious fatwas calling for their murder. And you have, in addition to this, other manifestations of genocidal anti-Semitism, which include a populist anti-Semitism in the streets of Europe, expressions of Jews to the Gaza. Again, I can go on quoting at length here. The genocidal anti-Semitism of ISIS itself and other terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, because they are killing others, and we must not forget that, and killing them more than they have been going against the Jews, they also always add, we will get to the Jews, and you find the incendiary incitement there as well. Or the online genocidal anti-Semitism, where you've got almost every 60 seconds or 50 seconds, as studies have shown, this kind of incitement to racism, hate, and indeed genocide. And so it is that under this phenomenon of genocidal anti-Semitism, Israel becomes the only state in the world today, and the Jewish people become the only people in the world today that are the standing targets of genocidal anti-Semitism. And I've left out even some other manifestations of it, but you get the point, and it brings me to the second metric, and I'll move more quickly. And I'm referring here now to what I would call demonological anti-Semitism, being the globalized indictment, and this is a second metric of the new anti-Semitism, the globalized indictment of Israel and the Jewish people as the embodiment of all evil in the world today, of Israel as a racist, imperialist, colonialist, ethnic cleansing, child-killing, apartheid, genocidal Nazi state, the embodiment of the worst evils of the 20th century and constitutive of all evil in the 21st century. And so it is then that Israel and the Jewish people become not only the only state and the only people that are standing targets of genocidal anti-Semitism, but the only state and the only people that are systematically accused of being genocidal themselves. The whole serving as a form of prologue, if not justification, for the incitement and assault upon Israel and the Jewish people, as a warrant for genocide or justification for that genocide, and the fundamental denial of the rights of the Jewish people and only the Jewish people in that regard. And so if the first indicator of the new anti-Semitism, or the first metric, namely the public call for the destruction of Israel and the Jewish people, that is the first, and if in the second metric, Israel and the Jewish people are the embodiment of all evil, warranting the assaults upon them, then the third metric is political anti-Semitism, a denial of Israel's right to exist to begin with, or the denial of its legitimacy, or the denial of the Jewish people's right to self-determination, or the denial even that the Jews are a people. As Martin Luther King Jr. put it, and I quote in conclusion of this third metric, it is a denial to the Jews of the same rights, the right to self-determination, that we accord African nations and all people of the globe. In short, Martin Luther King Jr. concluded, it is anti-Semitism. Which brings me to a fourth metric, and that is increasing anti-Jewish terror, underpinned and beginning with anti-Jewish hate and incitement, which leads to that terror. And finding expression, if you will, in terms of the Palestinian terrorism, in the glorification of that terrorism, the celebration of the terrorist as a martyr, the rewarding of by both Hamas and the Palestinian Authority of that terrorism. In a word, the incentivization of terrorism as we've seen it. Now, I referred to the beginning of the 20th century with regard to the phenomenon of the first metric of genocidal anti-Semitism. You find in this fourth metric of the intersection of incitement leading to terrorism and anti-Semitic incitement leading to terrorism, and I could use many case studies in terms of what happened in Israel alone at the beginning of the 21st century, which has been increasingly forgotten. But if you want to understand the psyche of the Israeli people today, then you have to understand that from 2000 to 2004, in what was called the Second Intifada, itself a kind of sanitizing term, what really was one of the worst terrorism, and I'm speaking here in empirical terms, that one has witnessed in contemporary history. Some 600 Jews were murdered in the first 2 years of that Intifada, so to speak, equivalent to a half a dozen 9/11s in comparative demographic terms. And at the same time, and this goes ignored, is that there were a series of major attacks that never took place because they were thwarted. I'm referring to the attempt to bomb the Azrieli Towers, which could have been Israel's 9/11. Specific anti-Jewish terror, which included the targeting of synagogues, Jewish community centers, the Hebrew University, I can go on. And regrettably, what we were witnessing in all this is the ignoring or marginalizing or sanitizing or indifference to such attacks. Let me give you a personal experience, and I'll close this metric with this experience. I was in Israel over the December-January break, December 2015, January 2016. And I went there to be part of a meeting of an international assembly of Jewish parliamentarians. When I arrived at the airport on December 20th, I did not know and read on arrival in the paper that there had been on our way to Israel 3 terrorist attacks in Ra'anana. As it happens, my daughter and grandchildren live in Ra'anana, so I called immediately to my daughter and said, "No, we're fine, Daddy," but our neighbors, in fact, were attacked, but happily, they're fine too. I won't go into any more that was taking place in that December. I'm just going to give you another second case study. On January 1st, New Year's Day, I'm walking to visit my son who had just made Aliyah and get caught up in a dragnet because of a terrorist attack on Dizengoff in the heart of Tel Aviv. And then, some 2 weeks later, we've forgotten about it now, a pregnant woman was attacked and fortunately survived, and with the fetus, who happened to be my cousin. I tell you all this because when I returned to Canada, I had a meeting, as it happened, with the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. We are old colleagues, being in Parliament together and the like. And he said, "So, Irwin, how was your Christmas and New Year's?" And I told him that I spent, the holiday in Israel, so to speak. And then I told him about these 3 events that had taken place. And he looked at me and said, "I'm sorry, Irwin, I didn't know about that." And in fact, nobody in Canada really knew about that, because while Israel was experiencing this type of state-sanctioned incitement to genocide that led to terrorist attacks and the like, Canada and Canadians, and happily, were on vacation. And I can tell you up to the present moment that we happen to have an Israeli channel in our home in Canada. So I watch the Israeli news every night. And every night, almost, you'll see that it leads off with some terrorist attack to which sometimes even the Israeli public becomes inured in some part of Israel. This has been particularly prevalent. I've been back in Israel this past January, and we had these terrorist attacks. Regrettably, it is not understood and not experienced and not felt and mostly not even known by the international community. And because the international community was not aware of it when it began at the beginning of the 21st century in Israel, it was not prepared for what then was a terrorist attacks in Europe, for then what happened in Paris and Copenhagen and Brussels. And if you look at those terrorist attacks, you can find anti-Semitic footprints which ended up in those acts of terrorism. And so the interaction between anti-Semitism on the one hand, and not only terrorism against Jews on the other, but terrorism against Europeans on the other. And again, the notion that while it begins with Jews, tragically, it doesn't end with Jews. Which brings me now to the final metric, and I'll close with this. But this is the most important one. And that is what might be called the laundering of the delegitimization of Israel and the universal public values. And I'm going to mention 4 public values, one example on each for reasons of time. The first is the laundering under the protective cover of the United Nations, the laundering under the authority of international law, the laundering under the culture of human rights, the laundering under the struggle against racism. I mentioned this because, and I can tell you as somebody who lives and works in the world of human rights, the Jewish community is very often not there. They're with and amongst the Jews, but they're not interacting in the human rights community where this laundering of delegitimization is taking place. And you have to be present, and you have to be engaging, and you have to be acting if you want to counteract. Let me take you the first rubric. The laundering of delegitimization under the protective cover of the United Nations. I'm not telling you anything new if I tell you that it's an annual ritual at the United Nations where every December, and it happened again now, some 20 resolutions of condemnation are adopted against one member state of the international community, which happens to be Israel, and 4 resolutions against the rest of the world combined. So it's not only that one member state is singled out in a breach of equality before the law, it's that we're giving exculpatory immunity to the major human rights violators, which acts as an incentivization for their crimes against the innocents of their countries. And these are the kinds of things that we may not always appreciate as well. And I can tell you as somebody who's a member of the Canadian delegation to the United Nations, what is important here is not only the critical mass of indictment against Israel in these resolutions, but the critical mass of exposure to that indictment. If you know that this has been going on now for some 45 years, consider how many people come to the UN and sit there as members of their country's delegation, academics, parliamentarians, faith leaders, journalists, and the like. Until the resolution is passed in December, it goes through a 3-month process of discussion and debate. They come there as tabula rasa, as basically uninformed. But after 3 months of the drumbeat of indictment, then they internalize the notion of Israel as the major human rights violator of our time. And in a world in which for over 40 years now, human rights has emerged as the new secular religion of our time, then if you posit Israel as the major human rights violator of our time, Israel emerges, as it were, if I can use a contemporary metaphor, as the new Antichrist of our time. Which brings me to the second, and this is a very pernicious one, I can tell you as a law professor and the like, and that is the laundering of delegitimization under the authority of international law, as distinct from the protective cover of the United Nations. I don't know how many people in this room know that the contracting parties of the Geneva Convention have come together 3 times in the last 50 years to put one state in the docket for its violations of international humanitarian law, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the like. No, it's not Iran, it's not Syria, it's not Russia, it's not Sudan. All 3 occasions, only one state in the international community was put in the docket. I'm not saying that Israel is not itself responsible for any violations of international humanitarian law like any other state, but to be the only state singled out 3 times in 50 years where the rest of the world has enjoyed exculpatory immunity. And here, where, as I say, as a law professor, this is taught in the jurisprudence of the law schools of Israel as having been indicted for in the last 50 years, they don't tell you the context of the nature of that indictment before the Geneva Convention. Which brings me to the third example of the laundering of delegitimization, and that is laundering under the culture of human rights. I reference this in terms of Israel emerging as a new antichrist of our time. I won't take any more time. I can cite chapter and verse in that regard, maybe just one example, that in 2006, the head of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, Louise Arbour, herself a former colleague of mine and a member of the Supreme Court of Canada, went on to become the UN Commissioner on Human Rights, called me and asked me if I would join a commission of inquiry into the killings of Palestinians in Bet Hanun in northern Gaza. And she said, Bishop Tutu will be one member of that commission and you will be the second. I said to her, will this commission also be going to Sderot in the Negev? And she said, well, why would it be going to Sderot? I said, because, and we saw this in the earlier video, because of the rockets fired from Bet Hanun into Sderot. When Israel responded to the rocket fire, regrettably and tragically, one response went astray, and some 14 Palestinians were killed. She said, well, you know, you can be a member of that commission and you can share that. I said, Louise, I've read the resolution establishing this commission of inquiry. It says in the resolution establishing the commission that Israel willingly murdered 18 Palestinians in Bet Hanun. So what is there to investigate? This commission of inquiry has already predetermined the outcome, has not only put Israel in the docket, but in fact in this Alice in Wonderland situation, the sentence has already been adopted even before the evidence has been considered. And I can go on, Operation Protective Edge. I don't know how many of you know the Commission of Inquiry that established Operation Protective Edge by the UN had 18 references, 18 express references to Israeli criminality in the resolution establishing an inquiry into the Israel-Hamas war, and not one reference even to Hamas. So is it surprising that the outcome was as it was? And finally, the final example and case study has to do with the laundering of delegitimization under the struggle against racism. Let's face it, the worst thing you can say about any particular state is to refer to it as a racist state. The very label supplies the indictment. And if any further proof is required, then you refer to it as a racist apartheid state. Because those who drew up and draw up this indictment know very well that apartheid is defined in international law as a crime against humanity. And so if Israel is an apartheid state, it is a crime against humanity. And if it's a crime against humanity, then it has no real right to be. But it doesn't stop there. It's also referred to as a Nazi state. So not only does it have no right to be, but we as an international community have an obligation to see that there is no right to be, because we have an obligation to see that an apartheid Nazi state cannot remain as a member of the community of nations. And so we have to appreciate the effect, the cumulative effect. And I just gave you very quickly, you might not think it was quick because of the time, but I gave very quickly one example, and there are many, under each of the rubrics of delegitimization, namely delegitimization under the authority and the protective cover of the UN, under the authority of international law, under the culture of human rights, under the struggle against racism. And so let me close very quickly with just some recommendations. And the first has to do with what I just ended here in the matter of the laundering of delegitimization under these 4 universal values. And you know, if you speak about delegitimization, I can tell you, I go to the campuses often, and they'll tell you what Israel, is being delegitimized. It deserves to be delegitimized because of being an apartheid. So I'm saying if we want to counter it, if you reference it in terms of Israel, you won't succeed. But if you go on the campus culture, or if you talk to the leadership, and we just met, I'm here with Brandon Silver, we met with parliamentarians in 4 countries now that we've been in on a variety of issues. But if you tell them, look, forget about Israel. This laundering of delegitimization under the protective cover of the United Nations, etc., is eroding the integrity of the United Nations. It's diminishing the authority of international law. It's corrupting the culture of human rights. It's undermining our struggle against the real racisms and the real apartheids and the real gender apartheids of our time, whether it be in Iran, Saudi Arabia, or elsewhere. So that if you care about these universal values, then you have to be protecting these universal values. Forget about the question with regard to Israel. And I think that's one of the important things we have to do. A second thing is we've got to get out of the docket of the accused and stop always being defensive as the accused in the docket. We should take issues of international humanitarian law seriously and become the plaintiff, become the claimant, instead of saying we're not going to have anything to do with the United Nations and we're retreating from the United, for all the reasons I said, no, we have to engage with the United Nations. And the manner of engagement can be something that took place just 2 months ago that I had occasion to participate in. I'm using it as a case study. I don't know if Simcha Golden is here in the audience now. That is the father of Hadar Golden. Because some of you may know, is Simcha here? Okay. So, some of you may know Simcha's and Leah Golden's son, Hadar Golden, was murdered and the remains abducted by Hamas in violation of a United Nations mandated humanitarian ceasefire during Operation Protective Edge. 3.5 years later, the family cannot get any information from Hamas, nor has Hamas, as they are obliged under international humanitarian law, either provided any information or repatriated the remains to the Golden family. Now, I mention this because we went before the United Nations Security Council in what was called the ARIA hearing. And this is a fascinating exercise. All members of the UN Security Council were present except for China, which apologized for not being there. Leah Golden gave a very compassionate and compelling talk. I then identified, and I'm not going into it, 7 violations of international humanitarian law by Hamas. And as I said, as a result of the reconciliation agreement with the PA is also the address. I can tell you, and this may surprise you, and we have the pamphlet if anybody wants to show you, that at the end of that hearing, all members of the UN Security Council identified with the pain and plight of the Golden family and others murdered or missing in Hamas, recognized the violations of international humanitarian law committed by Hamas, and recognized that the United Nations, as the trustees of international humanitarian law, has a responsibility to remedy this, and that this must begin with also holding the PA accountable. I'm using this as an example because if we don't use United Nations in the manner in which it was intended to be used, as I began in my lecture now on the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was intended to promote and protect human rights, that grew out of the ashes of the Holocaust, the former Secretary General put it, and intended to prevent and protect succeeding generations from the scourge of war, then we are not only allowing the continuing singling and discriminatory actions to take place against Israel, we are harming our common humanity as a whole. And so I say, and I'm reminded here, and with this I close, of my parents' admonitions to me when I was young, and my mother and father would say, my father would say to me that I had to understand that, as he put it to me, before I could understand the profundity of his statement, but I'm leaving with you, this is to me, he would say to me that tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue, is equal, as he put it, to all the other commandments combined. And this, as he put it, must be that which you teach unto your children. And that the word tzedek in Hebrew or even in Arabic requires at least 3 or 4 words in English or French to accommodate it: justice, charity, righteousness, and the like. But when my mother would hear my father saying this, she would say to me, that if you want to combat injustice, if you want to pursue justice, then you have to understand, you have to feel the injustice about you. You have to go in and about your community and feel the injustice and combat the injustice. Otherwise, the pursuit of justice remains a theoretical abstraction. So that's our responsibility in terms of protecting our common humanity, in terms of protecting the universal values. It's not just a matter of Israel and the Jewish people being singled out for differential and discriminatory entitlement. It's a matter of protecting our common humanity as part of Tzedek Tzedek Tirdof. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cotler. We will now have a short break up to 11 o'clock and then we go on. Thank you. Mr. Myers and Mr. Griegert, please join me.